Welcome everyone to the local traffic safety area academy. My name is Anthony Chamont from Tyndale Oliver. Quick introduction, as I always do. Everyone that is here today received the email that is up on the screen, something very similar that got you to where we are. A few important pieces of contact information there. My email, anthonychamont@tyndaleoliver.com, is there if you have any questions about where to download the presentation. After the webinar, Dennis's email is here as well. He is our Safety Academy coordinator. There is a link to the Tampa Bay Traffic Safety Academy webpage below that. It takes you to our webpage that has information about upcoming webinars. Dennis will address it during his intro as well, but we currently do not have a webinar scheduled for the next month. So this is the last webinar until the next one gets scheduled. So keep posted for upcoming webinars that are planned. And if you're looking for information from the prior webinars, here we have the list of all of the presentations, the actual PDFs of them, and the recordings of each of the presentations that we've done in the past. So this is the location where you will be able to go to download the recording of today's webinar. With that, I will hand it over to Dennis for his introduction of our speaker today.
Welcome. Good morning. This is Dennis Falloon. Did you send the screen over? Share screen?
Yes, I did.
Huh. Can you see my screen?
You may have given it
to
me.
Again.
Okay, I got it now. Good morning. I'm Dennis Falloon, the FDOT Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy Coordinator and Consultant, and I want to welcome you to the 9th webinar for 2018 for the FDOT Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy. Today's safety webinar topic is biking facilities at intersections, and it's part 3 of a series. And Brooke Struve, PE, Safety and Design Engineer, FHWA Colorado, will be presenting. There will be a couple of poll questions with today's presentation. With that, I'd like to kind of give you an introduction overview of the Academy. And once again, this is the FDOT Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy. And it's been set up and it provides information on safety-related issues to enhance your local safety programs. And it's in the 6th year, and it's usually scheduled from 10 to 12, and it's usually a minimum of 1 hour, but no more than 2 hours. And Anthony's already gone over a couple of links here that regard registration and to the web page. Also, this is the calendar of scheduled webinars. And as Anthony mentioned, there are no additional webinars scheduled at this time, but they're in the process of working on that. So today is Biking Facilities at Intersections Part 3. And those that are participating that can get AICP credits, this will be the documentation we sent out for this webinar, and I believe there's maybe 1 or 2 other ones I have to send in, and those will be in by Monday morning. And then if you are a professional engineer and you need PDHs, you need to follow this process, and there's a form out there that you can link to, and you can get the necessary credits. Also, this is my contact information if you have any questions about the Academy or anything on this webinar. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Brooke.
Good morning. You should be seeing my screen now with the beginning slide.
Yes, you're good.
So it's a pleasure to be joining you again. We're going to talk today more particularly about designing for bicyclist safety at intersections. And just a reminder of who I am. In your handout, you'll have the same slide with my contact information. So please feel free to reach out to me or reach out to your local FHWA division office if you're looking for some technical assistance on this or other topics, and we can put you into touch with the person who can help you best. I also want to remind you, if you've joined us on previous webinars or if this is new, the area of designing for bicyclist safety, and especially in relation to traffic control devices, is changing very rapidly. And it's sometimes difficult to get a good photo showing everything that's precisely correct and current. And there might be something that we want to illustrate that shows some outdated striping. Just remember to always check the current MUTCD and current interim approvals and experiments before applying traffic control devices for bikeways, because something that you might see even in these slides will be outdated or incorrect in some way. I also want to remind you of some of the concepts that we discussed in our previous webinars. These key safety factors for designing for bicyclist safety: speed, number of lanes, visibility, the type of traffic, how much traffic there is, how many large trucks are traveling on that roadway, where the conflict points are, how close the bicyclist is to moving motor vehicles, the pavement condition, how well the bicyclists control the vehicle, or even if there's grade or turning maneuvers that might make it difficult for a bicyclist to maintain control, and connectivity of an overall network. And many of these factors are going to be very critical to designing for bicyclists at intersections. Certainly, if we can reduce speed, that reduces the risk of a severe crash. Number of lanes makes an intersection very complicated for a bicyclist to maneuver through. Visibility is probably where we have the most opportunity in terms of countermeasures, trying to make the bicyclist more conspicuous to motorists and trying to make those conflict points more conspicuous. And certainly conflict points at intersections are a key concern. We're going to start off with what you might not usually think of as an intersection, but a shared use path crossing of a street would be a form of intersection. And we want to be thinking about pedestrians and bicyclists at these locations. And to start off, we have a poll question that we'll get some help with here.
The poll question is up on the screen. When designing a shared use path crossing of a street, who should yield to whom? Motorists should yield to bicycles, or bicycles should yield to motorists? Give everyone a few moments here to vote. Looks like we have most of our audience has voted. I will go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Brooke, it looks like we have 63% of the audience saying that, 62% of the audience saying that motorists need to yield to bicyclists, and 38% of the audience believes bicycles should yield to motorists. So it's about a 60-40 split.
Okay, I appreciate you all answering that question. I'm interested because I guess if someone were to ask me what I should do when I'm designing, I would say it depends. But very often on these shared use paths, we're asking pedestrians and bicyclists, or more particularly bicyclists, to wait for opportunities to cross, and the motorists may or may not be identifying this as a location that they should be yielding, and particularly when it's a question of a bicyclist and a motorist. But it's much easier for a motorist to stop their vehicle. They simply move their foot to the brake and come to a stop, as compared to a bicyclist who has built up all that momentum and worked very hard to get it. They have to stop, They might have to take their foot off the pedal, take their bottom off the seat, and if they don't have to do that, they can maintain the momentum they have, and they don't have to work so hard to get up to speed. And so I would generally say if traffic is light and there's good visibility, I would rather have the motorist yielding to the shared use path. On the other hand, if there's some visibility issues, if there's really heavy traffic, you might need to do it the other way around. But remember that it's exacting a cost on those bicyclists, and the more you make it difficult for them to maneuver on their path, the more likely they are to violate the traffic control devices you've put into place. So let's look at a couple of these types of crossings. Here's a crossing of a side street, and this is a perfect example. I've seen locations where you might have a crossing similar to this without all the enhancements of driveways to a very low volume driveway to a business where you might have 2 or 3 cars coming in and out a day, and they put stop signs for the bicyclists on the path, where in that situation, I would have done it the other way around. In this location, you can see they've added some features where they've raised the crosswalk, they've added some markings to make it very visible. They've also pulled it away from the primary roadway. And there's some guidelines. This comes from the Small Towns and Rural Multimodal Networks guide, where they suggest, depending on the speed, as the speed gets higher, they recommend pulling it a little further away from the roadway. And one reason for this is the turning vehicles that may be turning onto that side street. I had the experience in Daytona as a bicyclist on a shared use path. I was in the position of that bicyclist you could see on the right side of the crossing. And there was a signalized intersection or signal at this intersection with a permissive left turn. And the motorists that were approaching from behind me and wanting to make the left turn onto that side street were moving so fast that when I was looking for gaps in traffic, I could not tell if the approaching cars were going to continue straight or make that left turn before I was going to be able to cross that crossing. And so having some more space or giving a little bit of forgiveness for a car that has been focusing on making the turn can now pull onto the side street and have a little bit of room to pause and wait for the bicyclist or pedestrian can be helpful. So in terms of designing a shared use path crossing, there's sort of a flow that, or a cycle that we're going to go through as we consider this. First, we've got to look at the geometric alignment and the terrain considerations. You know, is it a 90-degree crossing? Is it skewed? Are there grades that we have to contend with? You know, what can we do to improve that? And then there's the roadway characteristics. How many lanes? What are the speeds? What are the volumes? And then we want to check the sight triangles. What's the visibility? A bicyclist is going to be approaching that crossing anywhere from 10 to 20 miles per hour or slower if they're yielding or looking for traffic. And so we want to consider carefully the sight triangle for both the pedestrians and the bicyclists. And then at that point, we determine which leg of the intersection, or whether the shared use path or the street is yielding at this crossing. And at that point, we can look at the potential treatments that we can add to enhance the safety and visibility of that crossing. And we might, you know, iterate through this process a couple of times, going back and forth to refine our design. Here's one example. In this case, we're using yield signs. You could do a similar layout with stop signs, but with this layout, we have the path yielding to the roadway, where there's an advance warning sign for the bicyclist that they should yield ahead. There's a yield sign. I'll also point out that they have a street name sign. Very often we forget about putting street name signs for bicyclists on a shared use path, or even putting street name signs that give information in both directions on a street, even though the street might be one way, because pedestrians and bicyclists might be traveling opposite to motor vehicle traffic. So street name signs are important. And then you notice on the roadway, we have a warning for the pedestrian crossing ahead or the shared use path crossing ahead, and then there's a shared use crossing sign right at the crosswalk. Alternatively, if we are asking motorists to yield to the pedestrians and bicyclists, we can have the yield warning ahead sign, the yield sign at the intersection. We have the shark's teeth, or we could have a stop sign and a stop bar. And for the bicyclists, we have a warning sign to indicate that there is a crossing ahead, so that they might choose to slow down and be cautious to make sure that motorists are truly yielding for them. Once we've figured out those features of who's yielding to whom, what's the geometry going to be, where are our sight triangles, we can look at some additional countermeasures to improve safety. Like, we've mentioned the advanced warning signs and the stop bars. If we have multiple lanes approaching the crossing, we probably want to have an advanced stop bar instead of placing it immediately at the crosswalk, because this allows the bicyclist or pedestrian to have a better view to see that both lanes of traffic have yielded to them or have stopped, as opposed to having the first car stopped and blocking their view of what's happening in the adjacent lane. We can also have a raised crossing, or even add some beacons or lights, or to improve the yielding behavior, like with a rectangular rapid flashing beacon or a pedestrian hybrid beacon. So here's an example, again, from the Small Towns and Rural Multimodal Network Guide, where they've used a raised crossing. They've put some warning signs, and they're asking motorists to yield to the people using the trail. And then this is an installation in Tucson, Arizona. This is the first application of a bike hawk, or a pedestrian hybrid beacon, where they have taken our traditional pedestrian hybrid beacon and adapted it for bicyclists, where they added the bikeway markings adjacent to the crosswalk markings, and they've included some dynamic signs for the bicyclists telling them bikes wait, bikes okay. And they've also had some signs, bikes use pedestrian signal, which I think they're referring to the bikes wait, bikes okay head that they have there. There might be some things that you would want to refine if you were trying this in your own location, some things that we've learned from this installation. But this is a good example of taking traffic control devices we already have and refining them to improve the situation for a bicyclist. Let's move on to what we typically think of as an intersection and how we might think about bicyclists at those intersections. When I started my career as a designer, I am saddened to admit that my consideration of pedestrians and bicyclists was very limited. When we were designing urban corridors, we would think about the turning movements and how many auxiliary lanes we needed at the intersection, how long the queue lengths needed to be. Someone else over in traffic and safety was figuring out the timing, and that wasn't my concern. At the end of that, we might lay out a striping plan and throw in some crosswalks and some curb ramps. And I remember some projects where they were wanting to have bike lanes, but because it didn't connect to anything, we said, well, we're not going to stripe it for now. We've left the space available for when it connects up. I think there were a lot of missed opportunities there. And I often see some missed opportunities as I'm driving and writing about. And there are some corridors that I've seen in the Denver metro area where you're riding along on this bike lane and you're approaching an intersection and you see this sign, bike lane ends. And so now it's a free-for-all. What do I do at the intersection? You've got to figure it out. And then immediately beyond, the bike lane picks up again and it says bike lane ahead or bike lane begins. And the bike lane begins at the intersection. And this continues all the way along the corridor. The bike lane ends at the intersection and it picks up on the far side of the intersection. I think this is an unfortunate circumstance and we can do a lot better. Here's another example of an intersection where they've done a good job of carrying the bike lane along the corridor and up to the intersection. But just look at this intersection and this roadway for a moment. I seem to recall the speeds were 45 miles an hour approaching from one direction. It was 50 miles an hour approaching from the other direction. Notice the number of lanes of motor vehicle traffic and consider the speeds. And also notice the number of turning movements. If you look at the far corner of the intersection, there's actually 3 channelized right turn lanes. You have multiple left turn lanes, dual left turn lanes, and motorists need to have guidance to get through the intersection and line up in the receiving lanes across the intersection. And I have to wonder what a bicyclist is going to do, crossing that expansive space with cars jockeying around for position to line up with their lanes, as well as, is the signal timed so that a bicyclist approaching that intersection on a stale green or even on a yellow can get across the intersection before the light turns red. So let's review some common intersection design principles for all motorists, the safety of all motorists, all users, pedestrians, bikes, and cars, and trucks. Certainly, reducing speed reduces that risk. That should sound familiar. Minimizing exposure to conflicts, communicating right-of-way priority, and providing adequate sight distance. And along with minimizing exposure to conflicts and providing adequate sight distance, I would add as sort of a subtext there, making sure the bicyclist is conspicuous and the conflict points are conspicuous. We have something like 32 conflict points at a typical intersection for motor vehicles, and then there's all the conflict points that pedestrians experience. Well, bicyclists have all of the conflict points of a motorist and of a pedestrian, as well as 2 additional conflict points, the right turn through movement conflict and the weaving to a left turn conflict. So here we have a typical intersection with an auxiliary right turn lane, and the bicyclist would be traveling straight through the intersection. And if there's a motor vehicle approaching, they are crossing the path of the bicyclist, or the bicyclist is crossing the path of the motorist, creating that right turn conflict point. In this case, we have, as I think you refer to them in Florida, a keyway, where the bicyclist has space between the right turn and the through movement motor vehicle lanes. And that should simplify the maneuvers, where the motorist is crossing the bike lane and looking at that conflict at a time that's separate from when they are looking for gaps in traffic and making a right turn maneuver. And so this is certainly a preferred layout for that right turn conflict, but we don't always have the space available to us, and or we might have some other type of intersection arrangements where it's more difficult to accommodate bicyclists. This is an example of a very simple left turn weave maneuver. Here we've got a roadway where the bicyclist is sharing the lane with cars, and they simply have to make a lane change to the left into the auxiliary lane to make that left turn. Doesn't seem too difficult, but I'd like you to notice a similar situation on this roadway. Off to the right side of the screen, you should see that there is a bike lane. And our bicyclist, who is wanting to make this left turn, had to cross 1, 2, 3 lanes of traffic and make a lane change into a 4th lane of traffic to make that left turn maneuver. And you can see where the difficulty arises. So I want you to be thinking like a bicyclist when you look at your intersection designs. Put yourself on their pedals, so to speak, and ask yourself, would you dare, or would you allow your children to travel through an intersection on a bicyclist the way that you have accommodated them? Here we've got a young lady who is approaching an intersection The motor vehicle lane that's closest to her is going to become a right turn only lane at the intersection. So at some point, she has to merge across that right turn lane to get over into or near the through lane. So as she's approaching the intersection, she looks over her left shoulder, trying to find gaps in traffic. Fortunately, there's no one approaching in that right turn lane because the traffic is moving pretty rapidly on this corridor. It's running at about 40, 45 miles per hour. She signals and moves across the lane and then continues on towards the intersection. And I'd like you to notice what space we've made available for her. She could choose to take the lane as a car would in that through lane, but that's rather uncomfortable at 40 miles an hour or so. Or you can do what she did and hug the lane line, but then you have the potential risk of cars passing her on both sides at a high speed and very close. It's a tough decision. It's a catch-22, but we've accommodated, of course, because we put a bicycle warning sign on the approach to the intersection, so that should solve the problem, right? I hope you understand that I'm using a little sarcasm there. So if we want to think about providing for safer intersections for bicyclists, let's talk about some of the countermeasures we can implement. First off, I want to speak to signalized intersections and the timing of and the features of those signals. Some of the things we can do is adjust the initial and gap times so that they're appropriate for bicyclists. Providing detection that differentiates bicyclists from other things that we're detecting in intersections. Providing something like a leading bicyclist interval or segregating the conflicting movements. First off, I'd like to mention the ME2CD does have a standard that, even in a small way, addresses bikeways. In section 9, it says, on bikeways, signal timing and actuation shall be reviewed and adjusted to consider the needs of bicyclists. Now, there might be some room or gray area on this one. First of all, what's a bikeway? Different people may interpret that different ways, but I would argue if bicyclists are legal on your corridor, or if you have a presence of bicyclists using that corridor, this would certainly apply. Or if you have actual explicit bikeway features, like a bike lane, whether it's being used or not, you might ask yourself, why is it not being used? Maybe it's because people are uncomfortable at the intersection. And if you have those bikeway features, this standard should apply. The other question becomes, what does consider mean? Do we consider it and discard it? Is it really fair to put a bicyclist in a situation where they're halfway through the intersection and the light turns red on them and motorists are starting to enter the intersection? We want to consider that carefully. This is a concept that one of my colleagues has been sharing with law enforcement officers as he's been doing training for them. And he had a law enforcement officer tell him that he was going to go back and review a crash he had investigated. A bicyclist was hit and severely injured, and he gave the ticket to the bicyclist, maintaining that the bicyclist had crossed against the light. But he's now going to go back and review that, having realized that maybe, just maybe, there was not sufficient time for the bicyclist to actually get through the intersection as he approached it. So this is something that we want to be careful of. So the things that we might want to adjust is that yellow change interval, making sure that as the bicyclist approaches on a stale green, when the light turns yellow, they have enough time to get across the intersection before the opposing traffic lanes turn green. And just remember, bicyclists are slower. They don't start up as fast. It takes a little more to get going, and they are not moving as fast as your motor vehicles. That AASHTO Bike Guide does have information on appropriate speeds and estimates for the time necessary for a bicyclist to cross the intersection. Some of the other features that we can add is relate to bicycle detection, and there are a number of options available. Certainly buttons, loops, video detection, microwave, radar, and infrared have all been used. We can add detection in the bike lane. We could even add essentially a dilemma zone detector. If we see a bicyclist approaching the intersection, we could extend that yellow time or green time just at those times when bicyclists are present, and thereby maintaining the operational efficiency of the intersection. By having very good detection, we only need to take that time away from motorists at the time when bicycles are present and using it. So if maintaining the operations is a concern, which it usually is, we can find a balance by using these detection devices. Just an example, on the left we have a pedestrian button, which is not going to be terribly useful for a bicyclist. They are going to have to get up over the curb, over to the sidewalk to reach that button, which is uncomfortable and difficult. And depending on the placement of the button, it might put them in a very inconspicuous spot so that when they're ready to ride across the intersection, they're at risk of being hit by a motorist who is turning right. Sometimes we have put push buttons close to the curb so bicycles can reach that, but we have to also weigh how that interacts with that auxiliary right turn lane. If the bicyclist is in a keyway, they're not going to be able to reach that button. Or if the bicyclist is making a left turn, that button is not going to be useful to them either. So being thoughtful about that, this might be the least helpful form of detection, but it is better than nothing. We can also use loops for bicyclists. There are some recommendations on the different loops that are most effective for bicyclists. That diagonal one on the far right is the best for detecting a bicyclist, but it's also important that the bicyclist be lined up appropriately for the loop to pick them up. And a bicyclist is not going to know that, particularly if there's been an overlay. Since those loops are put in, they won't even know that they're there or what they're for. We can use a pavement message, as you can see in the photo, to indicate to a bicyclist where they should be so that the loop will pick them up. But it would also be helpful to add some information or education so that they know how to use that device. Recently at a conference, I saw some vendors that are experimenting with some other devices. This would be useful for loops, but also for other things like the passive detection, where you can turn on an indication for the bicyclist to let them know that, yes, you have been detected, to give them some feedback and reassurance that the light will change for them. And yes, it would be good for them to wait for the light to change because there will be time for them. And as I mentioned with the passive detection, there are a lot of options that are getting better all the time. And very often there's arguments that, it's not working, it's not picking up bikes, but that has a lot to do with the sensitivity of those detection devices and how well they're adjusted to actually pick up the bikes. And we'd want to consider, in this scenario, the bicyclist might need to move over to that left turn lane to make a left turn maneuver. Or if we have something like a two-stage turn box, which we'll talk about later, having detection lined up to pick up bicyclists who are waiting to make a left turn in those scenarios. What we have pictured here is a leading pedestrian interval. You can see that the pedestrian is crossing or jogging across the street. He has the pedestrian indication, but the lights on the street are still red. The pedestrian's been given a few seconds head start to get firmly established in the crosswalk where he's most visible before traffic is allowed to go. This can be supplemented with a no right turn on red, or even a dynamic no right turn on red, so that those right turning vehicles are explicitly stopping and allowing pedestrians or bicyclists who may be using the crosswalk to get into that space and across the intersection. This can be adapted very simply by adding a sign that says bikes use PED signal. So if we're using leading pedestrian intervals, I would recommend giving the bicyclist the head start as well. And very often you'll see experienced bicyclists, as they approach an intersection where the light is stopped, they'll move to the front of the queue so that they can get across the intersection and have plenty of time to do that before the light changes again. And that puts them in a more visible position so the right turners don't get to them. And if they're watching those PED signals, they will very often go with the PED signal anyway. So let's give them the permission to do so. We can take it even further. We could use bike signal faces with those leading bicyclist intervals, but we can also completely segregate conflicting movements. If we're really serious about pedestrian and bicycle safety, we wouldn't allow permissive movements where they're crossing each other's paths at the same time. In this case, in Chicago, they have red left turn arrows on this one-way street to prohibit that movement at the time the bicyclists are permitted to cross the street. The bike signal face is a newer traffic control device that is available. It's something that you might want to use in situations where you have a history of bicycle non-compliance, maybe to emphasize that the signal means you too. This is an opportunity to provide that leading or lagging bicycle interval. If you have an exclusive right turn lane and you want to keep the bicyclist to the right of that right turn lane, then you need to have something like this where you're giving the bicyclist the green light and the motorist the red light, and you can segregate those movements. If you have a counterflow movement, like we saw in the previous photo, where bicyclists are traveling one way or both ways on a one-way street, you certainly need to have signalization for the bicyclist. And finally, if you have a complicated intersection, unusual movements, a five-legged intersection with weird maneuvers, you might need to use something like this just to help the bicyclist get through and across the intersection. So now we have another poll question, if you would bring that up.
The poll question is up on the screen. Only those traffic control devices shown in the current edition of the MUTCD may be used. True or false? While we wait for folks to respond, I had at least one person in the chat say that they were having issues with audio. If I can get a couple people in the chat pod, let me know if the audio on their end is okay or if it's in any way choppy. That would be great to get some quick feedback, because I'm hearing Brooke fine on my end. And it looks like most of the audience has responded to the question. I will close this poll and share the results. It looks like 43% of the audience say that it is true. Only traffic control devices shown in the MUTCD may be used, and 57% of the audience says that it is false. You're allowed to use items that are not in the MUTCD.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that most of you had the right answer, but let me explain a little further. We have a process where we can issue interim approvals for traffic control devices that haven't yet made it into the MUTCD, as well as an opportunity for agencies to experiment on new traffic control devices. We ask that you work with FHWA for those opportunities. Certainly, states have requested interim approvals statewide for different traffic control devices, like using green pavements or two-stage turn boxes. I'm sorry, that would be an experiment. I think I've got an old photo here, but you know, certainly the green colored pavement and the bike signals and things like that have received interim approval statewide for agencies to use. In those cases, we simply ask that you let us know that you're implementing it as well, and help us keep an eye on it so that when this becomes, or this is going to become more likely to be added in the next edition of the Green Book, In terms of experimentation, there's a little bit more work. We ask for some before and after data. We don't mean to make it difficult or hard to try out new devices. We simply want to learn what you're learning and be able to spread your knowledge across the country and try to add to the body of knowledge with traffic control devices. This picture is from a link that I will provide to you in the references at the end of the slide deck. It's one of the most useful links. It's one I go to frequently to check what's the latest and greatest for bicycle traffic control devices, like the bike box or the two-stage turn box, dashed bicycle lanes, which in other places is sometimes called advisory shoulders or advisory bike lanes. There's a lot of features that you can use that are not currently in the MUTCD. In addition to that, if you have some questions about the appropriate use of different signs, on the right side or the right column, there are some interpretations. And any of these, you can click on the link to read more information about that particular traffic control device. And so I would encourage you, when you download this slide deck, to find that link and save it to your bookmarks and go to it frequently. So we're going to talk about some of these countermeasures and traffic control devices that we can apply at intersections. And first off, if we're using our shoulders as our bikeway, we may want to rethink what we do at the intersections, because the shoulder is not a travel lane ordinarily. It is space that is available for the bicyclist. It lets them get out of the through travel lanes, but often those shoulders disappear when we get to the intersection. So we can simply do some modifications to the shoulder striping, or it's an opportunity, instead of the example I mentioned to you before where the bike lane ended at every intersection and picked up on the far side, maybe we add a bike lane only at the intersections and let people use the shoulder once they get beyond those difficult intersection locations. Thinking about where the risks are, that would make more sense. So adding bike lanes through the intersections, or simply adding some shared lane markings just to highlight the conflicts, and also to let bicyclists know what they're meant to do as they approach the intersection. So here's an example of something very simple that we can do for the shoulder striping to improve conditions for bicyclists. This is an image that we may see in the next edition of the AASHTO Bike Guide, so look forward to that coming out in the near future. But here we see a typical shoulder striping at a rural intersection, where it essentially disappears as you get to the intersection and the bicyclist is left to fend for themselves. We can simply make a few changes to that striping. For the bicyclist traveling from the bottom to the top of the screen, you can see that the shoulder stripe changed from a solid line to a dashed line and carried all the way to the intersection. And then they jogged over and carried an edge line around that radius so that they continue to provide the edge lining that they needed at the intersection. On the far side of the intersection, that dashed line picks up again and then becomes a solid line as it continues past the intersection and becomes the shoulder. And you can see where that edge line continues around the radius and then jogs over for that solid shoulder line. And if we really wanted to emphasize bicycle travel at the intersection, we could carry that shoulder line as a dashed line through the intersection just to provide a little extra guidance for bicyclists and motorists through the intersection, highlighting that potential conflict. And this would be essentially a free countermeasure. Next time you're doing an overlay through an intersection, simply putting some thought into what's happening with that shoulder striping. For roadways that have shared lane markings or are a shared roadway, you may have more than the rightmost lane that is now a shared lane. Any or all of the lanes at the intersections could be a shared lane now, so you might need to add some additional shared lane markings at the intersection, as well as the detection that would go along with those, so that bicyclists can navigate those intersections. If you have a bike lane at the intersection, you certainly want to move the bike lane to the left of those right turning motor vehicles. And in this case, I like the fact that we can see that there's a transition coming ahead where the bike lane is going away. It's maybe a shared roadway condition beyond. They didn't make that transition right at the intersection. They carried the bike lane through the intersection and beyond. If I were going to enhance this further, I might add some markings to highlight the conflict zone, just to further emphasize for motorists that they are crossing a bikeway or a bike lane, and hopefully call their attention to that. Here we have another image from the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Network Guide, where they have carried the bike lane across that side street crossing, but they've used dashed lines instead of just carrying a solid line to further emphasize for the bicyclists and the motorists that this is a conflict point and hopefully make them more aware. And this could be supplemented with the pictured sign, turning vehicles, yield to bicyclists. There are a number of different ways that we can highlight the conflict zone. This is an image from NACTO, and I will mention this is one example of some of those traffic control devices that are not consistent with the current MUTCD. Certainly we can use dotted or dashed extension lines through the intersection. The next one, the shared lane markings, that's not quite appropriate or consistent with what we are recommending. In this case, if you want to enhance those markings, you would simply use the bike lane symbol with an arrow rather than the shared lane markings. But you could do something very similar to that with that bike symbol and arrow. And then we can use colored pavement to highlight the conflict areas, or you can even use extra wide striping lines to really emphasize those crossings. Those elephant feet make it look almost like a crosswalk. And here's some different approaches that agencies have taken in terms of using green pavement, where you highlight just the conflict zone perhaps, or maybe you've got a green bike lane and in this case you leave off the green pavement at the conflict zone. And then my preference would be to highlight the keyway with green pavement just to keep cars in their own space, and highlight the conflict zone with the green pavement, dashing it as shown. My concern with the top image would be that the green pavement might make the dash striping a little inconspicuous. You could use the dashed green pavement in that top image as well. And generally, upkeeping a lot of green pavement is going to be more costly. So unless you have a particular desire or need to have your entire bike lane green, I would be strategic about your use of green markings and place them in those conflict points in those riskier locations, and then maybe save the expense and not have green bike lanes all over the place. Now, what if you don't have space for a keyway, or if you have a motor vehicle lane that's becoming a drop lane as opposed to it being an auxiliary lane, where we have a drop lane as pictured here, the bicyclist is actually supposed to yield to the motor vehicle travel. The bicyclist is yielding or weaving across the motor vehicle lane. So in this case, we don't want to connect up the dashed lines across the motor vehicle lane because we don't want to imply that the bicyclist has the right of way. So you can see here where they took the bike lane line and turned it into a dash line, and then it simply stopped. And then it picks up on the far side of the motor vehicle lane with a dashed line and then continues on with a solid line. Maybe if you wanted to enhance that a little further, you could put some more space, and particularly if there's higher speeds, you'd want more space from the right side bike lane to the left side bike lane to give them an opportunity to weave across traffic. But you could also add a sharrow in that space where the motor or the bicyclist is going to need to take the lane to get through the intersection. You could even highlight that sharrow further, or shared lane marking, with a green-backed sharrow or green-backed shared lane marking. If you don't have space for the keyway and you do have an auxiliary right turn lane, you can turn that right turn lane into a shared shared lane. This is an image from FHWA's Separated Bike Lanes Guide. And I will comment that this is one of those scenarios where I don't quite agree with what they have shown in the guidance. And I think we have some better examples of how they've done this. But you can see the concept where they've added sharrows to that right turn lane so the bicyclists can continue through the intersection. What I would disagree with is putting the sharrow side by side with the right turn arrow, because I don't want to imply in any way that there's enough space for the motorist to crowd around the bicyclist in that lane. I'd rather have the bicyclist firmly established in the center of the lane, and I want motorists to wait behind the bicyclist rather than trying to squeeze around, because if you have enough space for them to be squeezing around, you have enough space to be putting in a keyway outright instead of putting them in a comfortable position. Let me show you a slightly better example. But before that, I would also suggest that you want to add a sign such as this. You've got the right turn only sign for motorists, but we want to give the exception to bicyclists so that they're not technically violating the law by going through the intersection while using the right turn lane. And here's an example from Minnesota where you can see the positioning of the sharrows relative to the right turn arrow. They've got them all established in the center of the lane. They have put a sharrow, then the arrow, then the sharrow. And I would add to this that right turn only except bicyclists. The next countermeasure we'll talk about is a feature to help bicyclists who are wanting to make a left turn. This is another image from MACTO. This is a fairly simple intersection that we're showing, but just imagine if you had 3 or 4 lanes of motor vehicles approaching the intersection, and the bicyclist had to merge across those lanes to make that left turn. Not very desirable. In this case, as the bicyclist approaches the intersection, when the light is green, they can proceed across the intersection to the green box and then pull into the green box and wait. And when the light changes again, they can move across the intersection without having to make that difficult left turn weave. So some of the elements necessary for that 2-stage left turn cue box. You want to have the bicycle symbol, a turn or through arrow as appropriate. If the bicycle box is in a position that it's in conflict with those right turn maneuvers, you're certainly going to want to have a right turn on red prohibition. And you'll absolutely need to have passive detection to pick up those bicyclists in that bike box if that maneuver is not on automatic recall. And then we want to make sure that we're sizing those to prevent conflicts. They can be placed on either side of the crosswalk, although preferably you put them on the side of the crosswalk that's closest to the intersection so that bicyclists aren't having to cross pedestrian paths to move into the left turn box. But you might have some variations on that based on the layout of your intersection. And you want to make sure that the bike box is entirely out of the path of motor vehicles that are going to be moving through the intersection while they're waiting in the bike box. And let me just correct myself on that. I refer to it as a bike box. It's a 2-stage turn box. This is what we refer to as the bike box. And the terminology can get us sometimes because what we call the bike box is not actually square, and what we call the 2-stage turn box is square like a box. So be careful with your terminology. It's easy to slip up. The concept with the bike box is that it gives bicyclists an opportunity to get to the front of the intersection. So when the light turns red, particularly if you have a number of bicyclists who in a typical bike lane would be lined up at the back, they might have difficulty getting all the way through the intersection during the green time. It also provides an opportunity for that left turn maneuver. When the light's red, the bicyclist can move over to the left part of the bike box and wait for the light to change and then make their left turn. It also sort of groups all those bicyclists together. If there's a number of them traveling through the intersection, it gets them firmly established in a visible condition so that they're not at risk of those right turn maneuvers. So it increases visibility, it reduces signal delay for bicyclists because they're at the front of the intersection when the light changes. They're well positioned for that left turn. It reduces the risk of right hooks, except when the light is just about to change. And it groups those bicyclists to hopefully improve operations overall. One thing that you have to remember though, if you're putting bike boxes in, it has to be along a corridor where the light actually turns red on a regular basis, because if there's a lot of priority for that corridor and the light's usually green, there's never going to be an opportunity for the bicycles to move into that bike box. So the required elements, and I would refer you to the interim approval on that website I showed you, but this image is from NACTA, so there's some variations, but you have to have the advanced stop bar, the bike symbol in the bike box, the right turn on red prohibited unless you have an auxiliary lane to the right of the bike box. You need to have some setback from the crosswalk, a countdown pedestrian signal. This lets the bicyclists know they can look to their left or right and see if there's enough time that they want to move into the bike box before the light changes. And the appropriate yellow change and red clearance intervals. The other thing I would add is, we don't want to make those bike boxes too short, because on the bike, it might be a little hard to turn left and maneuver and straighten up. You're essentially having to almost walk the bike into position. So be thoughtful about how stingy you are with the space that you're providing for the bicyclist. So those are some of the countermeasures that we can use at three-legged, four-legged typical intersections. So let's talk a little bit about bicyclists at roundabouts and how roundabouts are designed for bicyclists. Roundabouts work well for bicyclists because of the nature of a well-designed roundabout. It slows the speed using those deflection angles, the truck aprons. You never, 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 ever want to put a bike lane in the circular part of a roundabout intersection, because we don't want motorists passing bicyclists in that intersection. Roundabouts are usually simple for bicyclists, especially a single lane roundabout. The splitter islands are going to give them a little more comfort, a little more space from moving traffic. And then we also want to give bike ramps to give people that are not comfortable taking the lane or using a shared lane. We want to give them the opportunity to get onto the sidewalk. And we want to think of that sidewalk around that circular portion of the intersection as a shared use path, giving a little more space than you would perhaps at a typical sidewalk. So here we can see a bicyclist as he's approaching the roundabout. The bike lane has ended and he is moving into the motor vehicle lane. The speeds are slower, so it's a much more comfortable maneuver here than it would be perhaps at a typical intersection. The bicyclist is maneuvering around the intersection in the rotary, taking the lane, firmly establishing herself in traffic in a visible location. This gentleman is continuing around the roundabout and about to exit. And here on the exit of the roundabout, the bike lane picks up again and the bicyclist is moving into the bike lane. And here's an example of a bicyclist who's using that bike ramp. The bike ramp is well positioned, so it's easy to get from the bike lane up onto the sidewalk. You might use some strategic placement of detectable warnings at the top of the ramp to make sure that a blind pedestrian isn't confused and thinks that this is a curb ramp, but also being thoughtful about the alignment of the bike ramp so that it skews back towards the bike lane so that it seems much less like a curb ramp. And certainly you don't need to design it quite so wide as you would a curb ramp. Now we have another type of intersection that is emerging. It started out with 5 locations across the country, but I think more and more are being developed all the time. And a lot of locations they're adding features of a protected intersection, maybe not having a full protected intersection, but adding certain features that would make it a more protected intersection. I use the term protected in quotes just because that's a term that maybe can cause liability issues, because if you have guidance for a protected intersection and you didn't install the protected intersections, that means you left them unprotected or unsafe, and we don't want to imply that, but we haven't really developed another term for these types of intersections. Here in this image, you can see some of the elements of a protected intersection, where we have a separated bike lane approaching the intersection. We have well-defined space for the pedestrians, for the bicyclists. We have these channelizing islands to slow down motor vehicle traffic, and also position motorists so they can have a better view of the conflict points as they're approaching them. So here's an illustration of how that visibility at those conflict points works. On the left, you see an overhead view of a typical bike lane, and the motorist is crossing across the bike lane. And on the right, you have an image of what the motorist's view would be out their side and front windows. You can't see the bicyclist at all because the bicyclist is behind their right shoulder. Here at a separated bike lane with protected intersection features, we have a little bit different view. Because the bicyclist is further away from the motor vehicle lane, the motorist has completed more of their turning maneuver, and when they've reached that crossing point, you can see through their side window they have a much better view of the bicyclist at the conflict point, and hopefully will respond accordingly. Here we have some real-life examples. On the right, we have a conventional bike lane. You can see where the bicyclist is in the blind spot of the motorist. Whereas on the left, at this protected intersection, the motorist has started their turning maneuver and they have a much better view of those bicyclists. So let's identify and look at some of the features of a protected intersection. First, we have the corner refuge island. That creates that turning maneuver of the motorist, gives the motorist hopefully enough space to actually pause without impeding the through traffic that's coming behind them, if you have the space for that. We have the forward queuing area for the bicyclists, where they can queue up beyond the crossing ped and bike travel. We have the motorist yield zone. We have a pedestrian crossing island. We have a pedestrian crossing of the separated bike lane, and we want to remember that that is a traffic lane, so we need detectable warnings for pedestrians so that they know that they're crossing a conflict zone. We have a pedestrian curb ramp, and let's go back to that image for a moment. So those are the key features, but any of those features can be adapted and used in different ways at different intersections. This is a photo that I took in Indianapolis, where on the approach, we have a typical bike lane, but on the far side of the intersection, it's more of a separated bike lane where it is to the right of the park strip, adjacent to the sidewalk. And so they've used some of these channelizing islands to help with the transition, but in essence, they've also created sort of a protected corner on this intersection where motorists, as they're making a right turn, are going to be well positioned to view pedestrians and bicyclists who are crossing the intersection. Here's another view from the stop bar of what that channelizing island looks like. And it's a good example of thinking about our transitions. And when we've got one type of bikeway transitioning to another type of bikeway, thinking about how we connect the dots. And here we've got an image from Chicago. This is one of the first 5 locations for a protected intersection. And they did this visualization to for their public meetings and their studies to explain what it is that they were planning to do. Coming from the top of the screen, we have a buffered bike lane, And then continuing to the left, we have a separated bike lane. And they wanted to provide something better at this intersection. So we have all those elements. We've got the corner refuge island, we have the pedestrian refuge, we've got the queuing area for the bicyclists. And this looks like a really good plan. And this is what it looked like when they implemented it. You can see how much pedestrian and bicycle travel they have. And they were really pleased with it, but they did find that they had a few problems with implementation. Some of the motorists were getting a little confused and thinking that this was an auxiliary right turn lane, and they were pulling into this bikeway and causing a few problems. But they didn't decide that this was a failure and rip it out. They tweaked it a little bit. What they did is they changed out their sign. They took out, well, first they added some posts to better channelize. And maybe if they were to do it over again, they would have extended the concrete channelized islands, but they were able to quickly fix it with these posts and provide a little more positive control at the approach to the intersection. And then they changed out the sign, and instead of having that sign that had that right turn arrow that maybe people were intuitively thinking as a right turn only lane, they added some lane assignment signs where they have defined that the motor vehicle lane to the left is for through and right turn movements, and the bike lane to the right is for through and right turn movements of bicyclists. So I would encourage you to dare to experiment. Try these things out. Don't be afraid if they don't work perfectly the first time you implement them, and be prepared to make a few tweaks, because ultimately what we're getting is a much better design for bicyclists. I would also encourage you, if you haven't been on a roadway and a bike, that you should take the opportunity to do that. Just as we drive through our projects and walk through our projects, the bicyclist experience is different, and there's things that you will learn on a bike. I had the opportunity to ride a bike through this Chicago intersection, and one thing I noticed that we maybe haven't figured out, when I approached the intersection at the red, I of course stopped at the near side of the crosswalk. But when the crosswalk cleared and the light hadn't changed yet, I wasn't sure if it was precisely legal for me to pull forward to the queuing area, or if I needed to wait for the light to change and stay back where I was on this side of the crosswalk. Those are things that we perhaps don't have the answers for, and it's something that I never would have thought of if I hadn't gotten on a bike myself. We were doing a workshop in Houston where we had participants ride their bikes on a route that we had mapped out. And one of the participants shared with me afterwards that this corridor that we had ridden on was one for which she had done some planning work and some studies in preparation for a project. And she discovered that by getting on a bike, she noticed things that she had never noticed before on all her previous site visits. So these are two thoughts that I'd like to leave you with. Dare to experiment and get on a bike. Put yourself on the pedals of the bicyclist for whom you're designing. You see here some references. I've mentioned them during the presentation, except for the one at the end. I thought it might be interesting for you. This is a YouTube video from the city of Edmonton. They've come up with some fun videos for educating the public on how to use some of these traffic control devices. And this is just one that I provided a link for you. Once you find that, you can find some of the others that they have available. And just some summary thoughts. Remember those intersection design principles. We want to be looking for opportunities to reduce speed, those turning movements especially, minimizing or making more conspicuous those conflict points, making sure we're communicating who has the right of way, or even how to navigate those large complicated intersections, and making sure that we have provided adequate sight distance, or putting the bicyclists where they're most conspicuous. And a few other thoughts. Adapt what you already have so that it is functioning well for bicyclists. Take a look at your intersections. I stood at a lot of intersections with my watch and counted just a few seconds. And if a bicyclist was approaching that stale green, they wouldn't be able to get through the intersection in time. But that can be quickly changed. So thinking about signal timing, or changing our shoulder striping markings, or adding some enhanced markings to make those conflict points conspicuous, or even adding a turning vehicles yield to bicyclists sign. And then adding specific features for bicyclists, the passive detection, the bike boxes or the two-stage turn boxes, or those channelizing islands to separate them more from motor vehicle travel. And finally, dare to experiment and test out your experiments. And with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions that anyone has.
Sure, we have a couple of questions that have come in the chat. The first one is regarding recumbents and handle cycles. Are there any special design criteria or kind of thought given to them because of their visibility since they're lower than a typical bicycle, or is it just, you know, like that's not really considered?
I think it can and should be considered. We certainly have some criteria in the AASHTO bike guide for different types of bicycles, although now that I think about it, I don't think they have the recumbent bicycle included. But if you have a number of people using recumbent bicycles, that's going to change your sight distance issues or your sight line issues, and it's something to be thoughtful about. Certainly a lot of the features we talked about, especially the protected intersection, I think is going to be beneficial for those recumbents. Another question that's emerging is, what do we do about skateboarders, scooters, and those other things as well? And they have almost the same eye height, a little bit different depending on what they're doing. But, you know, they might have some speed issues as well. Most of the time, the skateboarders and scooter users are going to have a similar speed to the bicyclists. So it seems like it's an appropriate usage for them to be in the bike lanes, but we just don't know a lot. I have chatted with a gentleman. He had a bicycle hand pedals and a tire that attached to the front of his wheelchair, and he indicated that he had on occasion had some near misses and people nudging him because they weren't seeing him because he sits lower. And you imagine a van approaching a bicyclist such as that and looking out their side window and not being able to see them. So maybe even an education issue for people who are using those shorter vehicles to make sure they have those flags that stick up in the air to try to make themselves more visible.
Great. Back when we did the poll question about who should yield, someone in the chat commented that when in question, refer to the statutes. So if there's ever any issues or questions, I mean, all these things are out there. You just need to kind of search for the statute depending on what municipality you're in, and you know whether or not they can be on the sidewalk, they have to be in the bike lane, who yields, and all those things are controlled by law. So just kind of research that and, you know, ask questions of your local safety engineers if you have any questions about it. It was more of a comment. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I'll just say I absolutely agree with that because there's a lot of local variations, but I also will mention, I know of one court case where the judge ruled that a motorist should have yielded to a bicyclist who was in the crosswalk. So, you know, in his interpretation, the bicyclist didn't have to be dismounted to be treated as a pedestrian would who was using a crosswalk. So that's something to keep your eye on and be watching for as well.
You mentioned early on a small towns and multimodal guide. Is there a link that you are able to share to that
Yes.
for the audience?
That's provided in the references, but you can also simply
that was
Google,
one of the references. Okay.
Yeah, you can Google FHWA small town and rural, and that should take you there.
Okay, perfect. Someone commented that they commute of a fairly long distance to work every day on a bicycle. It's a 9-mile commute. They occasionally have cars try to bully them out of an intersection or even off the road. Motorists need to understand that bicycles have the same rights as they do. Our infrastructure and bicyclists is way behind other large metro areas and light years behind other countries such as Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. Are there any goals or political will to add barriers between motorized traffic and bicycle lanes?
Well, I think there's been a lot of interest and desire for more separated bike lanes. I think that's a design that we've been adopting from the Netherlands, and the protected intersection is certainly a Netherlands style design that we've been trying to implement. And certainly the US DOT policies and FHWA policies fully support considering bicyclists as an equal mode with other modes. And so on a national level, there's certainly the policies in place to support that, using safety funds for this purpose, using state highway funds on a state highway to include bicyclists on that state highway. Sometimes those policies don't filter down. One thing I will comment, we are light years behind the Netherlands in what they've been doing, but 20, 30 years ago, the Netherlands did not have this biking culture that they do now. They made a change, they made a conscious effort, and they got there. And now they're the hallmark for what we want to be doing for bicyclists. And so it is achievable. It is achievable in our lifetime or in our career life. So, if we keep working towards it, taking those incremental steps whenever we can to try to improve upon what we've been doing, I would certainly encourage that.
One step at a time. There was a comment about the clearance intervals at intersections, noting that the all red times are typically not timed for bicycles, meaning that if a bicyclist entered the intersection on the last second of yellow, they would not clear the intersection during the all red phase because they're traveling slower than the vehicles do. So that's just something of note. The signal timing, if you have an area with particularly high bicycle usage, those all red clearance intervals may need to be looked at.
Well, and I would say not just places with high bicycle usage. If you have bicyclists using that roadway, or if you have a bike lane, you should be timing that for bicyclists. And if you're concerned about it degrading overall signal operations, then see if you can incorporate that passive detection to use it when needed and not use it when not needed. But in what other scenario do we allow conflicting traffic to have a green light at the same time, essentially? And that's what we're doing. We're telling the bicyclists they can still cross the intersection, and they really can't. The other opportunity maybe it would be, if you really can't adjust those all red intervals, maybe use that bike signal, giving the bicyclist a red light before you give the motorist the red light, so that they're stopped in time so they don't get caught in that scenario.
One more question in the chat regarding the push buttons. There's a couple of pictures where some bicycle push buttons were shown, and they seem to be within the clear zone. Are those push button installations crash worthy? Are they in the clear zone? Or what's the criteria for that?
Certainly, clear zone considerations are important in urban areas because fully 1/3 of our run off the road fatalities do happen in urban areas, and so that is a concern. I would like to refer you to the roadside design guide that has incorporated some information. The risk of hitting a roadside object is much less if you can get the roadside object about 4 feet out and away from the motor vehicle lane. So that can be helpful, but that's in conflict with putting those push buttons in a place where the bicycles can actually reach them. I honestly can't say that I know how those are designed in terms of crashworthiness. I know that signal foundations are not meant to be breakaway and fall over because that would cause more problems than leaving it where it is. And we usually try to put the signal foundations further away from the intersection. I recall from the pictures, though, the pipes on those are fairly small. You could make those potentially break away, and the risk of having a breakaway push button would be fairly low. And so that seems to be what would make sense, is have a breakaway push button. But really, I would suggest getting away from the push buttons in general at a at a signalized intersection, look to using the passive devices, because I think you have a lot more options available to you using passive detection.
Regarding the passive detection, does that detect all bicycle types? Because I know that there's some fairly, high-tech materials, the carbon fiber, and I mean, are they able to detect? I'm assuming it works like an induction loop. Are some high-end bikes not detectable by those?
I've heard differing opinions, and I don't know that there's been any substantial research defining that. In some places I've read that the gears themselves are usually made of, there's enough metal and they're made of a substance that it should be detectable. But then, there's people who argue that they're not getting detected. And I don't know if that's the limitation of the induction loops or if there's some other factor involved. And so that's another reason where passive detection using the infrared or the radar or some of those other devices might be better as people are using different composite materials for bikes.
Interesting. At the moment, we have no other questions in the chat. We'll give folks a few minutes here to see if our quick discussion here has, made them think of something else that they would like to add. In the meantime, though, I wanted to thank you again, Brooke, for doing this 3 webinar series on going in depth into bicycle and pedestrian safety, different aspects of it. I mean, everyone that is involved in the safety world obviously is aware that bicycle and pedestrians make up an overwhelming majority of our fatal and severe injury crashes. So that's why we focused on this webinar series, and you've done a great job taking us through a variety of topics. So I wanted to thank you.
Brooke, this is Dennis Floon. I ditto with Anthony just said. I think it's been great, all 3 series, so I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes.
There's a question about other design courses. Does FHWA offer a course focused on these design issues?
Absolutely. I teach a 2-day workshop covering these topics in more detail. I've also done it as a 1-day. I've also done a 1-day workshop where we focused a little bit more particularly on separated bike lanes. There's also an NHI course available. It's offered through our Office of Environment. It's called Planning and Design of Bicycle Facilities. I would say maybe wait on that particular course because they're currently going through an update. It's been many years since it's been updated, but in about 2 years, that course should be updated. And then if you're interested in other multimodal courses, we have a workshop that's being developed on performance-based intersections, where we're focusing on providing for all modes at an intersection. And we also have workshops on safe transportation for every pedestrian, which focuses on pedestrian crossings. And we also have designing for pedestrian safety in a 101 and a 201, where we look at pedestrian safety on roadways and intersections and crossings.
To verify,
if you have questions about any of those,
I was
just going to say, if you have questions about any of those courses, you can reach out to your local FHWA division office, or you can contact me and I can either put you in touch with the right person or help you get a course scheduled.
There was a question about how to access the interim approval sheets. If you can provide a link to that. Was that one of the ones that was in the page of the presentation that had links?
Yes, that's on the page of references, but if you want to try Googling it, it usually works to Google FHWA MUTCD bicycles, and that will generally get you there. But if not, It's in those references.
Great. And the only other comment in the chat, other than thank yous that are coming in for the presentations, is in light of the Tampa Bay area being one of the most dangerous places in the nation, is kind of historically. I think there was a recent news article about that as well. That we need to see if we can get you down here to do the 2-day course in Tampa for all the folks that are in this area. So we'll work with the district safety office down here and see about getting that to happen.
Yeah, Kevin Burgess and oh, I'm trying to remember the other name, but yeah, you've got some folks that they're Mary O'Brien who are looking at these issues and concerned, and so I'll suggest to them that there might be some interest in Tampa to have one of these workshops brought there, particularly with the recent media attention for your bike history.
Yes. All right, well, we have nothing else in the chat. With that, I will end the recording and we'll stay on the line for a few more minutes in case anything else comes in. Again, Brooke, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Now, Anthony, these recordings are posted somewhere. Could you send me a link to where those recordings are posted?
Yeah, absolutely. For the folks that are still on the line, the recordings in the invitation that you received today that got you to see the webinar, there's actually a link to our Tampa Bay Traffic Safety webpage, and all of the recordings are there for all the webinars that we've done in the past. Someone actually recently mentioned to me, and I don't know if it's a Windows codec issue or, you know, we're trying to work our way through it, but we typically convert the recordings to Windows media files, and it seems like some of the very early recordings are not able to be played on the current Windows media players because of changes that have happened in the last 6 years. So we're working on getting those recordings updated to the most recent codecs so that people are able to view them. So if anybody is interested in an old topic and you are not able to download or, you know, get the recording to work, let me know. We're working on converting those, possibly all of them to MP4, so that, you know, we're able to view them. Because for whatever reason, 6 years ago we chose Windows Media Player, and it seems like we're having incompatibility issues with the current version of the Windows Media Player files.
And for everybody that's still on, just understand too that you can both hear the recording, and you can actually look at the PowerPoint, but that's in PDF format. So you have access to both. So that's good.
Okay, I'm going to actually end the recording. I did end it a second, but yes, I'll bring up the link. But let me end the recording, and then we'll do some wrap up here.